that today's webinar will be recorded, and we hope to make that link available to folks in the next few days. And with that, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Laura Berger, to go through the agenda and introduce our speakers. Laura?
Thanks, Alexandra. Good afternoon. I am Laura Berger with the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and I will serve as the moderator for today's webinar. We are excited to share and discuss findings from a new report from Upturn, which explores the hiring assessment technologies that job applicants encounter each day. Employers have long used digital technology to manage their hiring decisions, and now many are turning to new predictive technology tools to inform their hiring processes. With more and more companies, especially those who employ a large number of entry-level hourly workers, using predictive technologies to automate the screening and assessment of applicants, it is important to better understand what these hiring technologies look like and how young job applicants are experiencing them. Unfortunately, we are hearing from many of our grantees that young people are struggling with how to navigate online hiring processes. For example, online applicants typically do not receive any feedback if they have been screened out, thus making it difficult for young people to understand what would make them a better applicant for future opportunities and ultimately how to be better job seekers. So it is our hope today that during the webinar, you will gain some better understanding of hiring technologies and how young people are experiencing them, and learn about ways practitioners can use this information to A, help young people navigate these technologies, and B, to engage with employers in crafting solutions to support more equitable access for entry-level job seekers. Again, I want to mention that after we hear from the panelists, we will have some time for questions. So I encourage you to ask a question if you have one using the Q&A window located at the bottom of your screen. So with that, let's get started with a quick review of the agenda. After I introduce today's speakers, we will hear from Upturn to learn more about their research and findings on hiring technologies. Then we will be joined by two practitioners who will share their experiences around navigating hiring technologies, and we'll also have some time for Q&A at the end. Next slide. So I would like to introduce our speakers today. First, we have Erin Reiki, Managing Director at Upturn. We have Urmila Donardin, with Research Assistant at Upturn. And then later in the webinar, we will be joined by Heather Worthley, Executive Director at Port Jobs in Seattle, Washington, and Adam Artman, Assistant Director for Strategy and Business Development at Ohio Guidestone in Cleveland, Ohio. So now I will kick it over to Erin and Urmila to walk us through the research and findings.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura. It's really great to be here. My name is Erin. Upturn is a small nonprofit based in DC, and our mission is really focused around justice and equity wherever technology is used. And obviously hiring is an important area there. I want to talk to you just briefly about kind of the motivations for this report. This is a headline from the Washington Post that came up last year. And I'll just read it. A face scanning algorithm increasingly decides whether you deserve the job. And, you know, we see a lot of headlines, a lot of kind of marketing materials coming out of Silicon Valley. There's a lot of attention to new hiring technologies. When we looked out at the research and the publicly available material, what we didn't see is really kind of a basic gut check about what are large hourly entry-level employers actually doing in their application processes today. So with support from the Casey Foundation, we were able to do just, you know, I want to be honest, this is really some basic empirical research about what we're seeing on the ground and what it means for young job applicants. I'm really excited that we get to present to you today. We do a lot of work with state and federal policymakers, but it's kind of a special treat and a unique thing for us to talk with folks like those on this webinar who really work with young applicants every day. So really look forward to trying to make this research relevant and answering your questions. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Urmila, who is the lead researcher on this report, and she'll walk you through our findings.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So I'll just start with a very brief overview of our research and then get into it. But as Erin said, in the process of our research, we're trying to identify large hourly employers which we defined as those with approximately more than 200K employees in the United States. And so that left us with 15 very large companies that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, like Walmart, Amazon, CVS, etc. So for each of these employers, we submitted an online application to understand better what the process was. Can people hear me? Sorry, I can't see everyone's video, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, your audio is coming through okay, Mila.
Let's see. Oops. Okay. Damn. Yeah, can you all hear me?
You're coming through okay, Mila. Can you hear us?
Oh, okay, cool. Sorry if y'all heard me swear to myself as my internet cut out. Okay, well, I'll keep going. I'll keep my video off just in case. Sorry about that. Okay, where were we? Yeah, so for each of the employers, we submitted one application to each of them. All this happened in February of 2020, so shortly before the pandemic began. We did submit some repeat applications throughout the course of the year, but generally what we gathered was from before the pandemic. So for each employer, we took a screenshot of every single page of the application process so that we could record and like better analyze and understand this after we filled out those applications. And then in the background, we ran a web proxy that basically collected any information that each application site was pulling externally. And this was to try to understand what vendors were involved in the process, what other tools might be involved in the process. And this was done to varying success. We could kind of see what types of technologies were in the background, but overall, it's very difficult from the applicant perspective, which we had in this process, to understand what exactly is going on. But after that, we conducted interviews with employers, technology vendors, and psychologists to better understand what these selection procedures were trying to get at and better understand the purpose of a lot of these different tools. And so finally, we took these all together and basically made our research report. Next slide. Okay, so there are several steps in the online application process. Not all of these steps happen at every employer, but this is generally what we saw. In this presentation, we'll go deeper into two of these steps, which is number 2, the screening questions that applicants encounter, and then also step 5, which is about pre-employment tests. But there are other steps here like gathering background information, work experience, resumes, and even further interviews, which we didn't really take part in our research process. So if you're interested in learning more about these steps, I would say definitely look at our research report, but in this presentation, we'll really just be going over screening questions and pre-employment tests. One last thing to note is that virtually all the employers that we looked at use an applicant tracking system, which folks in the audience may be familiar with, but I'll cover just in case. Applicant tracking systems are generally like umbrella technologies that allow employers to pull from different vendors when they're trying to do any step in this application process. So 2 big names in this are IBM BrassRing and Oracle Taleo. Those are generally what we saw. Next slide. Okay, so screening questions can look different at different employers, but generally the first 3 questions we saw almost everywhere. So they asked for applicants' age, their education level, and their authorization to work. And so what classifies a screening question for us, especially for these 3, is that you need to have it in order to work. It's a basic qualification. But you'll notice that some of the things on this slide are not necessarily black and white, like prior experience can be gray, so can previous employment with the company. And by gray, I mean, it's not clear to us whether having employment with a company previously will result in an automatic rejection, the same way that being too young to work at the job will result in an automatic rejection. So there is some lack of clarity, I think, here. A couple other things we saw were schedule availability as a basic screening question. And we'll see in the next slide what this can look like. 3 employers also asked for what an employee's desired or what an applicant's desired pay is. So I think it's important to note that there's a possibility, we're not sure of this, that if applicants write in a higher pay than what the employer will provide, that they could be automatically screened out or rejected. So it's important to note when applicants are going through this process or for people advising folks who are filling out these applications. Physical ability was also asked about at 2 employers. I think it was like a barista position at Starbucks asked if you could twist and turn and pick up heavy things, as well as a mail courier position. And lastly, 2 employers did also ask about possession of reliable transportation. So again, this is a bit gray. Does public transportation mean reliable transportation? But it was really just a yes or no question. Next slide. Okay, so here's a sample of the scheduling questions. This was a part of a longer, this is an excerpt of a longer list of questions, but here you can see the high school diploma question, whether you're a college graduate. And then you can see a general availability fill out questionnaire, I guess. And this is just asking about weekdays and weekends, so it's not very granular, whereas other employers might ask about your availability on each day of the week. Next slide. Okay, so for pre-employment tests, we generally saw 3 types of tests. There are more types of tests that other employers might use. Some of the things that we didn't see are like more AI or more complicated forms of tests. These are generally like simple, more traditional forms of employment testing. So I'll go through each of these examples, or each of these types of tests, and then I'll show a few examples. So the first type of test is a simulation. So these ask candidates to perform tasks that are similar to what they perform on the job. So an example would be a change counting task where it'll tell the candidate how much change is owed, and they'll select the smallest number of bills and coins and submit that answer, which you'll see in the next slide. The second type of test is situational judgment test. So this is more open-ended in the sense that candidates are given a work problem or job-related situations. So an example could be a coworker not performing well, or there's a disgruntled customer, and then it gives them several choices to select from. And the questions that we saw generally ask candidates to select what they're most likely to do and least likely to do. And then finally, personality tests generally claim to measure applicants' motivations, preferences, interests, emotional state, things like that. I think most of us are probably familiar with these types of tests. And we'll get into more examples of how these can get sticky. And in general, I think it's important to note that there is conflicting evidence as to whether personality tests actually genuinely measure candidates' traits, but they are so popular that it's important to know how to, I guess, approach them, especially if you're an applicant. Okay, next slide. So this is an example of the simulation that I mentioned. It says, a customer member owes $10.51 and pays $50 in cash. The change due is $39.49. So if you'll notice, they're not asking candidates to calculate how much change is owed, as in a real life job, the cash register will probably tell them this. So it's really just asking them to do what they would need to do on the job, which is count out bills and coins for customers. So this is one of the more straightforward job skill testing. It makes sense that if you can do this successfully, you'll very likely be successful on the job. Next slide. So this is a little bit, this is a personality testing question, and I think is a little bit more sticky. It asks, if I had to list everything I felt grateful for, it would be a very long list, and candidates rate their agreement from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So you might be asking yourself, what does gratitude have to do with being a warehouse associate? And so I think that's where personality test questions get difficult, is that candidates' answers don't necessarily demonstrate whether they'll be successful on the job, or you could see someone who maybe is in a bad place or having a bad day and are not feeling grateful for things, but would still be a successful warehouse associate. But I think just a tip for applicants seeing these types of questions, I think it's easy to overthink them and say like, oh, well, I'm not always grateful, so maybe I'll do agree or neither agree nor disagree. But from our conversations with psychologists and vendors, employers generally want to see applicants that are grateful and will follow directions and are like generally in a good mood, and there's nothing wrong with saying you would strongly agree to a question like this. Okay, next slide. This is another personality style question, and it gets at candidate honesty. So it's asking candidates whether they believe most people can be trusted or whether it's smart to question people's intentions. And so this is commonly termed as an integrity test question, from what we've heard from psychologists and vendors. And so these kinds of tests, again, are trying to understand how honest employees are. And I think it's important to reiterate the way a candidate answers this question doesn't necessarily show whether they are trustworthy or not, but the logic behind such questions is often that if you as a candidate believe most people can be trusted, it's because you can be trusted. And if you think it's smart to question people's intentions, it might be because you're not trustworthy. Again, not clear if that's truly evidence-based, but that's generally the thought process behind these. Next slide. So these are a group of questions, all from CBS, that I think it's clear what the theme is. I'll just go ahead and read a couple of them. So this asks, I prefer a job where there are high performance expectations, or I am highly compensated for my work. I am held accountable for store outcomes, or I can have a stable, secure lifestyle. Outstanding services provided to customers, or I don't sacrifice my personal life to meet my work goals. So I think you can get the gist. It's kind of asking candidates, are you willing to work for lower pay? Are you willing to have somewhat of a stressful job that kind of maybe can interfere with your personal life? And I think these are some of the questions we find most concerning because, we saw them and people answer them every day to get these jobs, but it's pretty clear that wanting compensation and wanting a stable, secure lifestyle probably has less to do with personality and whether you would be good at your job as it has to do with just someone's life circumstances. And so these questions, I think, often are getting at employers' other motivations rather than an applicant's qualifications. But in these cases, again, employers are probably looking for candidates who are willing to say that they're going to perform to high expectations, they'll be held accountable for store outcomes, give good service. So as unfair or kind of strange as these questions are, that's generally what it seems to be that employers are getting at. Yeah, okay, next slide. Oh yeah, this is all Aaron.
Great, thanks, Ramila. I just want to wrap up here in the last few minutes. And first, I just want to make a big point, right? We started out with the slide of wondering, gosh, to what extent is artificial intelligence or something like facial analysis used in these hiring processes? And what we saw is actually a lot of the things that are grabbing the headlines are not yet the exact kind of things that applicants are encountering when they're applying for large hourly employer jobs today. Instead, we're seeing some relatively traditional screening questions, some relatively traditional sorts of psychological and personality quizzes deployed on the internet at scale, right? And so I just want to like wrap up with some concerns for us to think about here as we enter a conversation. The first is, I think job applicants need to be careful with these screening questions. As Ramila said, you can probably immediately screen yourself out if you mess up the pay question. When you're asked for your availability, I think it's really important that applicants provide the maximum availability they're comfortable with and not just their personal preference, because that's another screening out point that we suspect is automated. There's nothing to do about background checks, which can be illegitimate and discriminatory barriers to employment. But we're just noting that in these large applicant tracking systems that employers are using, it's never been easier for employers to plug in kind of automatic background checks and background screening processes. So for anyone that's engaged with state legislatures, I think it's increasingly important to have the policy advocacy about background checks and employment on point. One of the really frustrating things here is that virtually no employer offered us great feedback during the application process. So it's unlikely that your applicants will know, did I mess up the change counting tests? Did I answer, the quote unquote wrong answers during the personality test? Was my shift availability mismatched? All of that kind of basic feedback is not given to applicants. And so it can be very, very frustrating, I think, to not know where you went wrong. If you're working with applicants with disabilities, obviously there are employers who have legal obligations to provide reasonable accommodations. Those were not very well marked or advertised through these application processes. So I think, just give special attention if you're working with non-neurotypical applicants or applicants that might struggle with vision or basic accessibility needs through these websites. I think that, just be extra careful to make sure that that they are finding what the employer provided as an outlet for reasonable accommodations, because those were not really front and center. As Ramila spent some time talking about, we saw a lot of these personality test questions, these really kind of squishy, soft questions that do not clearly measure essential functions for the job. And I think, it's just important to see the kinds of questions that your applicants may run into. And I think, this is just my view as Aaron. I think just some gentle coaching about what these questions are eliciting and why, and what good responses look like could probably be helpful. And then last, I won't go deep into the policy implications piece of this until it comes up in discussion. But state and federal law is really way behind where it needs to be right now. So I think we'll leave it there for now. I think what we've shown you, I think some of the most crucial, important pieces from the application process. The last thing I'll say before we kind of move into the panel discussion and the Q&A is, there's nothing completely magical about this research or what we did. Some of the policy stuff and the digital background forensics and the sussing out of who the vendors are is harder to replicate. But if you find yourself working with repeat large employers in your geography, by all means, head to the website and complete the application and take some notes for yourself. I think these applications are a moving target, and it's really easy to reproduce, I think, some of the basic work we did if you're working with, particular large employers on a regular basis. And with that, I will turn it back to Laura for the panel discussion.
Thank you, Aaron and Armila, for that presentation and all that helpful information. So now I am pleased to bring in Heather and Adam into the conversation, so we can have a panel discussion. We can start to share their experiences. So first, I'm going to ask Heather and Adam to briefly introduce the organizations so we have some context for their remarks. So Adam, would you like to go first?
Sure. Adam Artman, and I work with Ohio Guidestone. We're an Ohio-based organization. We are predominantly mental health, community counseling, and substance use disorder organization, but we do have a workforce development department. Our workforce development department, for the majority of our programs, works with 14 to 24-year-olds, and we do training in different types of sectors. So construction, manufacturing, healthcare, retail, and food service are our focus areas. And within that, we're responsible in many of our contracts for recruitment and eligibility, for training, academic and occupational training, and as well as placement and retention services. I think what I would mention, just to cap it, would be what's unique about our organization is our workforce department is part of a larger organization that has, a range of services and programs that we can provide our workforce participants so that they can be, we can wrap them holistically in these types of programs. So we've seen a lot of success with that. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Adam. And Heather, would you like to introduce Port Jobs?
Can you hear me now?
A little bit, still pretty faint.
Hi, I'm Heather Worthley, and I'm the director of Port Jobs in Seattle. We are located inside Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, and we connect job seekers from near airport communities, many of whom are immigrant and refugee speakers of English as an additional language, with entry-level jobs at the airport. And we partner with local community colleges to bring free credit-bearing college courses on site and offer them to airport workers as they advance in their career pathways. And we are delighted to be here today to help contribute to this discussion. We typically see about 6,000 people a year in our airport jobs office when there's not a pandemic on.
Thank you, Heather. So I think my first question to the both of you is, in listening, kind of as you listen to the presentation, what resonated with you? Are you seeing any of the same things in your work?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I think one of the things that resonated with me is this lack of employer feedback, right? We sort of joke and call it the abyss. So we've always had these large application systems where you send these applications. I think everybody's experienced this. You send this application in and you don't hear back, right? And you've sent 30 of them in and you don't hear back, and that doesn't feel really good. Well, with the added amount of energy and effort with a lot of these processes, that feeling of sort of being devalued at the end of that process, I think has exponentially increased. So a lot of our young people, they go through this process and they spend an hour, hour and a half doing these kinds of assessments, and then to get no feedback on that, again, can be really devaluing and really goes to sort of a sense of self and esteem, right? And so as a coach, as a practitioner in this space, it can be really tricky to sort of help keep them motivated along that pathway, but also prepare them to sort of feel of those things when they don't receive the feedback from employers.
And I'll add to that. We work with job seekers who are applying for jobs across the airport, so airlines, but also baggage and cargo and dining and retail and wheelchair assistance and everything in between. And one of the employers who we recently assisted job seekers applying online to, sorry about that dangling preposition, is our own Transportation Security Administration. So I think they probably qualify as a large hourly employer, and they have an incredibly complex application process, as I'm sure you can imagine, that also involves criminal background checks, personality assessments, physical, drug test, etc. But to get to any of that, you have to get through their online application, and it is notoriously difficult. So we recently partnered with the Transportation Security Administration at the request of the Port of Seattle, because like so many other employers right now in this suddenly hot job market, particularly at airports, they're having trouble filling TSA officer positions. And I think, it's very simple, but us sitting down with the employer, especially when it's a large employer, and being able to understand their application process start to finish and experience, as Adam was saying, and as Urmila pointed out, the experience from the applicant's point of view, that allows us to be able to render assistance to job seekers. So we've done a couple now of targeted application assistance events for TSA, where we're seeing, and they're primarily young adult applicants, come in, we provide the computers and the internet access, TSA comes, but we're in the room assisting, and folks are getting really one-on-one attention for online application assistance. And I realize that that is not really doable at a large scale, but for us, it's absolutely been a way to get in and be able to help folks get through that front door so that they can then address the rest of the process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Thank you, Heather. Or you can actually talk about it right now. I'm really interested in kind of what are some of the strategies port jobs have used or are using, in particular, what you're doing with the TSA, to kind of navigate online hiring application processes.
Sure. And I want to thank the researchers at Upturn. I think you're doing a huge service, because this is a problem that's only gotten worse during the pandemic, right? And we've talked in other Casey webinars about the digital divide and what we're all doing to address it. But I think that for our work with the Transportation Security Administration, not only breaking down the process so that our staff understand it and are able to render one-on-one assistance to applicants, but getting to talk to folks at TSA who are in a position to respond regarding criminal background checks and whether applicants should even bother applying if they have a criminal record. And so I just want to share that in our experience at Airport Jobs, we actually had a direct employee of ours, and we're a small nonprofit also. There are about 10 of us on a good day. We had an employee who successfully was hired at TSA, even though she had a felony on her record. And so in our recent meetings with TSA, I brought that up, and said, you know, it's especially critical now that so many of us are working with people re-entering the community from the justice system, that we be transparent. We don't want to waste job seekers' time if the answer is just no. But I know that it's possible for people to get hired even with a felony. And their response was, yes, honesty right out of the gate is what we're looking for. So the worst thing you can do is hope that we won't see that you have a criminal record, because we will. But if you come in and explain your story, then you can get in the front door, and it's possible for you to get all the way through the process. So I just highlight that. I know we have in Washington State some additional laws that protect job applicants from the employer looking at criminal background until they're fairly far along in the process. TSA obviously is a special circumstance, and the airport is a specially secure environment. But I think it's important that we who are in positions where we are able to talk with employer management at a higher level have those conversations on behalf of the applicants who can't.
Thank you, Heather. And kind of the same the question to you, Adam. Kind of what strategies or tactics are you guys using or have used to navigate these systems?
Yeah, so I mean, these systems are somewhat new for us up in Northeast Ohio, and sort of in the complexity that they're being rolled out. But I can tell you that, you know, our first strategy is to circumvent them, right? Well, the number one thing we try to do is build a relationship with those managers and recruiters on the ground level who have similar goals to us, right? You know, one of the things that we've noticed is that there's sometimes a misalignment between those recruiters who are looking to fill these jobs and those that are sort of at the higher level who've made the decision to make a capital investment in this kind of technology because, you know, they've got their reasons that list in, you know, I'm sure the tens of hundreds, right? And but those recruiting managers often have open positions that remain open. So they come to us and they say, what do you guys need from us, right? In order to make this relationship work. And we just say, hey, listen, your process is really complicated. Is there any way that we can get you in front of a group of our young people and we can circumvent some of this so that maybe they go right into the interview process, right? And that, again, that sort of reduces the amount of individuals who get derailed by this process. Now, unfortunately, that's not always possible. So, you know, when we are up against this process, typically we try to be really honest with our candidates that are going through our program. We are trying to be really honest about the ROI. You know, we're going to do these, they're going to be plentiful. There's going to be a lot of these things that we do, and the ROI isn't going to be great. So, you know, tempering expectations. I think the other thing that Heather mentioned is sitting side by side with individuals, if only to help explain sort of what questions actually mean, which I think is, you know, kind of difficult for our staff, right? I think our staff sometimes question the motivations of these kinds of questions, and they can be a little ambiguous. So, you know, I think it's a particularly difficult situation. I don't know that there's, you know, a great answer for it at this point. But I know that we're looking at our training and thinking, you know, maybe the traditional types of training that we do aren't enough anymore, right? Maybe we need to start thinking about that first door, opening that first door as a larger amount of the kinds of training that we do on a day-to-day basis.
So Adam, I have a kind of follow-up question. So similar to Heather's example with working, you know, TSA came to her because they were having issues with their hiring process, but in that communication, it somewhat opened a two-way conversation for the staff at Port Jobs to, you know, give some nudges or some advice to an employer for how applicants are receiving or experiencing the process. Or have you done any work or are doing any work with employers around this topic about creating more accessible pathways to employment?
Sure. So, you know, we have worked with TJ Maxx in the past. We've worked with Target in the past. We've worked with Target or Walmart more recently and Amazon more recently, right? And, you know, specifically some of these employers have come to us seeking advice on sort of how to build some of these pathways out, right? And thinking about deployment. You know, they don't really have a great sense of the communities that they're in, and they use the workforce development agencies to help them get a better sense or a better bearing, right, on some of those things. But when it comes to being a little bit more agile, when it comes to these technologies being deployed, some are more flexible than others. Some, their protocols are their protocols, and this is the process. Others, I think, are really great about listening to the conversation that's happening at the community level and saying, hey, we want to create alternative pathways for people to get into these types of positions.
Great. So, Aaron, I have a question for you to kind of, so in hearing some of these strategies that Heather and Adam are employing with their organizations, do you have kind of any additional advice? I know there's a question in the question box about if there's kind of any tips or tricks for navigating. Are there any additional pitfalls? I know some of them have been already pointed out.
Yeah, no, that's a good. First, I just want to start by echoing something that Adam said, which is, I think now is a great time to try to circumvent this altogether, right? I mean, we're in a moment in time where the dynamics of the labor market are such that there's lots of employers that are doing on-the-spot hiring, right? Like, show up, give us your basic information, you can start today. And so I think like the iron is hot for just trying to sidestep the online application portal as a first step for many young people, and having pre-existing relationships with employers or getting them to the job sites as a kind of a first exposure is probably now is a great time to do that. I think that for those of you that have sustained relationships with large employers, I think now is a really good time to just push them to think about like a more open hiring model, right? I mean, I think that no one wants there to be barriers in front of the employees they need at this moment in time. And so I think it's a really good opportunity to just try not to have to do it at all if you can. That's the threshold answer. I think, tips and tricks, right? Like, I think that the short answer is no, there's no real like secret tip here, except for if you are going through the online application process. I think the simplest distillation is you just need to be really careful not to trip up kind of an automatic screen out, right? Don't underestimate your availability. Don't overestimate your required pay, right? Make sure that I know that the personality test questions can be tricky, but again, as Urmila said, the bottom line is be grateful, cheerful, willing to work hard. That's your character when you're going through the online application process. Just getting people that kind of basic preparation, and I think just the context for, you're kind of fishing in a big barrel with these online application processes, and don't let that discourage you, right? I wish I had something better to say than that, but I think that's the basic thing, is just watch out for the tripwires that could lead to an automatic rejection. And I think now is a great time whenever possible to just build up those direct relationships and try to build, I think, the example and the tradition of more direct hiring.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. Shifting gears a little bit, we've heard a lot about what you kind of are doing and hopefully being successful at. I wanted to bring up a little bit more kind of what are some of the challenges you have faced when working with people and working with young people and employers around online hiring processes. Are there things in the space that you want to be doing or influencing, have yet to do so, or things that you or a collective we as workforce training providers could be doing better? This is for Adam and Heather.
I can jump in and take this one. So, I think that one of the things that Aaron had mentioned earlier and the research had mentioned earlier was just the idea that the salary and the scheduling and the way that this presents itself in a lot of the process isn't necessarily genuine, right? So a lot of our young people go through this process and they ask us for advice. Hey, what should I be putting on this schedule? What should I be saying around salary? I don't want to get screened out. So it's all about getting through the front door. I find a lot of recruitment issues are actually retention issues. And so what that sets itself up for later is for our young people to say, hey, this job really isn't sustainable for me. Even though on my application I put on like whenever I thought I would be available in sort of the ideal situation, or what I felt like I could do walking in the door in terms of salary, like this isn't actually sustainable for me. And so I think that that's really particularly tough when thinking about, these applications and then producing sort of a non-genuine response from our candidates. Additionally, these personality tests that they often do, it feels like an indictment of who they are, right? So when they don't hear a response, or it's not something that they don't get the job, they come back to us, and there's definitely a lot of social emotional learning that needs to sort of occur in that space, because a lot of them, again, feel like it's an indictment of who they are. And so even hearing Aaron talk a little bit about like saying this is the you that you need to take into this application process, in a time and space where we are celebrating like people's individuality and who they are, sometimes that can create a little bit of a conflicting message, right? And especially in our workforce programs. And I'll add this, whenever we talk to employers about why they've deployed this kind of process and they're using this technology, we typically get things like, it removes bias, or, they justify it based off of increased wages. Like, we're looking for the best people who are going to fit this profile because we're increasing wages. And, these things that reduce our risk and are more cost effective for us. And I think one of the challenges that we have is, I think that we need to do a better job of pushing back in the moment. When we hear these things, we need to be able to push back in those meetings. And to do that, I think it takes a little bit different of an approach. I think a lot of practitioners in this space come from a human service background, and to engage employers on sort of that business case in that business sense approach isn't necessarily the most comfortable thing in the world, right? So maybe some professional development there that gives us some more tools and ammunition in that kind of conversation. And to be honest, the research that's in front of us now helps us do that, right? It helps us get to the root of the issue and sort of tackle some of those assumptions that they're making on their end that may not be appropriate.
Yeah.
I'll just add, both Aaron and Adam have mentioned that these are very specific times we're living in with respect to demand and unemployment being back down to a relatively very low level. Employers are getting desperate, and employers at our airport, and I think all airports, are extremely desperate because they can't fly planes and serve passengers if they don't get staff. And that's the situation they're in right now. So it is an unusually good time to push employers on practices that we're aware of in some cases, practices that job seekers are helping us see in some cases. And also, I don't want to miss the opportunity to talk again about the digital divide as an equity issue, because all of this online application can't happen if someone doesn't have access to a computer and internet. And we continue to find that many of our young job seekers don't have adequate access. So we are trying to not forget the lessons we've learned in the pandemic, and we're trying to increase our computer giving away capacity, which Casey has helped us with through generation work, and also have folks come into our office and use our internet and our public computers in job application processes. And that both provides digital access for those who might not have it at home, and also provides an opportunity for our staff to deliver one-on-one assistance. And again, these are very basic things, but I think we learned a lot during the pandemic that I'm hoping we carry forward in earnest. When it comes to online job applications, people need to be able to get online.
Great. Thank you, Heather. So we are kind of now moving into the Q&A portion with our audience of the webinar. So please, if you have any questions, please chat those either into the chat box or the Q&A box. But before I get to some of the audience questions, I do have a question for Aaron, kind of building off of what you said earlier around policy, specifically kind of policy levers. I know you at Upturn do a lot of work around federal policy. Most of our folks may not engage with federal policymakers, but they do some advocacy work with local and state policy. So wondering, what are some of the policy solutions for this work outside of just practice solutions?
Yeah, and I'll be pretty brief here so we can get to questions and answers. But I think one take-home point, some of the good news I want to give is that given all the automation and capacity to automate so many steps of this process, employers actually do have the ability to give applicants more feedback, right? When you think about like the credit context, if a bank rejects you for a loan or something, they have to give you an adverse action notice, kind of explain roughly why that happened, right? I think it would be very, very reasonable at the state level or the federal level to have employers that use these kinds of automated technologies to have a requirement to give applicants feedback about why they were automatically screened out. I think that'd be helpful to the applicant. And as a second order benefit, I think employers would be perhaps less eager to use some of these fuzzy problematic personality tests. And so I think, you know, there's a lot of room, even if you stop short of like civil rights and anti-discrimination style laws. I think transparency can take us a long way. The last thing I want to say is that there's a lot of states right now that are passing bills that are really focused on like AI, artificial intelligence, and hiring technologies. And I think that the sort of model legislation we're working on at Upturn really kind of just sticks with the language of hiring selection procedures. So I think the short answer, and we are happy to share more details with anyone that wants it, or model bill language with anyone that wants it. I think transparency back to applicants about why they were rejected is really important. And then I think just requirements to use assessment instruments that are actually related to essential job functions, right? And I think these are all very reasonable things that could pay a lot of dividends for applicants.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. So going to an audience member's question. So this is building off of, I think, Adam's response to some of the kind of challenges you face with working with employers. The question is, what are some levers that workforce or economic development systems might use to influence employer hiring practices? Are there any pathways to scale or influencing mainstream behavior?
So I think that, you know, it's been mentioned before, sort of we're in this unique time, right? And you've got a lot of employers and a lot of government officials that are concerned with employers taking their business elsewhere, right? Taking the jobs elsewhere. And so, you know, I think that creates a lot of pressure at, you know, the government level, and that pressure trying to trickles down into the contracts that we have in workforce development to serve individuals. And, you know, I think, like it's been stated before, now is the time, right, where we need to have these conversations and employers are actually going to listen. As long as they can, as long as we're delivering them individuals that are trained and, you know, are capable on the job, I don't think that right now they care really how that happens. And so, you know, being able to understand the economics of the moment and being able to use those that pressure to help support sort of your effort to navigate or circumvent some of these barriers, I think is the best bet.
Okay, sorry, just monitoring the questions coming in.
I think we would be remiss if we didn't at least mention the monopoly that some large tech companies appear to have. And I know that there's important work going on to try to do something about that, but I also think it's relevant to this conversation. So more breakup of the tech monopolies might help in this process.
Thank you, Heather. So we do have another question. I think you guys have spoken a lot about how the pressures related to the labor shortages we are currently experiencing may kind of motivate employers to kind of shift their thoughts on how these hiring technologies are experienced. Was wondering if you guys have come across that if employers are shifting their thoughts about these platforms more from an equity and inclusion perspective, or is it purely now just more around the labor shortage?
It's been my experience that sort of money is the first hurdle, right? And so, you know, where there's a shortage in labor, or if there's a restriction to growth, right, that's where the conversation starts, and where it can go is sort of having an equity conversation, as long as that makes sense to some of their future goals and growth. That doesn't mean that there aren't employers out there where this is a central value or tenant and they say, absolutely, this is what we want to do. But the sustainability of that kind of direction really does still depend on the bottom line, or at least that's been my experience in the conversations we've had here.
Yeah, ditto. And we certainly have some really great employers, including some that would fit probably into your large employer definition. But again, the folks that we work with on the ground who are headquartered at SeaTac Airport we're able to form relationships with, have meaningful conversations with. We recently were able to engage some employers with a wonderful local nonprofit that's working to end human trafficking, businesses ending slavery and trafficking best. And we had several employers who were very willing to engage deeply and quickly with this organization and in a meaningful way. So I see this as being a time that's really ripe for opportunity, both to work on the bad actors, but also to engage those who aren't bad actors, who just have never really had to bend their processes very much.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Let me just add two quick things. I think the first thing is, I hate to say this, but sometimes people's kind of hype about technology and AI gives us a second bite at the apple. Because even though we're not talking about stuff that's fundamentally new, if you talk about like, have you thought about bias and algorithms? Suddenly everyone wakes up and listens to you for a moment. And so I think that sometimes that frame can be helpful to re-engage. I also think that, I agree with everything that's said about money is the first thing. Something that Adam said that stuck with me that I think has some potential is when you think about things like these personality tests, to say like, we are in a moment where we're trying to celebrate differences. We're trying to celebrate diversity. And part of that is when you ask these questions, this is like the uncertainty and damage that inflicts. And so I think there's some progress that I haven't yet seen yet that just pushes on a respectful hiring process, an inclusive hiring process. And I don't mean that in like a compliance way, like, are you, having adverse impact? That's a separate important conversation. But I think that, there could be, I think, some movement and pressure about having an inclusive hiring process, one that's simple, one that respects the applicant. I haven't seen a lot of conversation about that kind of on the national level, at least. I think that's important.
Erin, there's a question from the audience that maybe you'd be able to answer. They're wondering, are there kind of any maybe large employers who either speak out against these technologies or who are not using them? Like, is there like an influencing tactic, maybe not calling out a company by name, but if you also speak with companies, kind of are there companies who just do not use these sort of technologies and the reasons behind it?
Yeah, I think so. I don't have any off the top of my head. If you go back, for those of you that want to go back and look at the actual long report, we didn't see everyone using personality tests, right? And so you can see among the 15 large employers we surveyed who used what kinds of questions, who used personality tests and who didn't, right? And so happily, personality tests are common, but they're not universal. And so I think there may be some movement away from that. There also are some pretty serious movements around open hiring, like no background check, no experience necessary. And I think that, like, especially as we're in this moment and employers are experimenting with more open hiring, now is a good moment to seize upon employers that are doing that and celebrate that. But I would say go back and look in the report for what we know, I think, about at least the DC area employers today.
Okay, thank you, Erin. So I know we are almost at time, and before I close out, I would love to give the floor to either Heather, Adam, or Erin if you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share.
Just something Erin just said again that resonated with me. A lot of times what we're talking about is helping employers understand what their competitive advantage is. And, we do a lot of matchmaking. So, we try to give them metrics on individuals and their engagement levels and the projects that they've done and the completion as an alternative to sort of this system that is outside of their control, right? Or outside of our control. And on the other side, we've had a lot of success with employers bringing them in and saying like, hey, I know you think that you're putting forth a competitive offer here, but you know, our candidates have a range of offers that are far more competitive. And I think those conversations really turn the tables, and you start moving away from barriers, things like these processes and this technology, and you start getting employers selling themselves as to why they should be sort of that premier destination. And you know, they're looking for a competitive advantage, and for a lot of our employers, you know, talent is that competitive advantage for them. And so, you know, just to echo again for the 100th time, I think, but now is really a moment for us to have those conversations and to see movement in those conversations. The trick is going to be how sustainable those conversations can be in the future.
Absolutely. And then again, just coming back to the relationship building, and it lasts, of course, as long as that manager is on site. But we had just this past week a company, Swissport Fueling, that puts most of the fuel in the airplanes at SeaTac Airport. They are desperate for fuelers. They can't keep the airplanes full of fuel. And so they had an event. It was very targeted. We reached out specifically to community-based partners who were serving young adults that we knew were looking for jobs. And 3 people out of the 4 who came to this little event were young adults of color from one particularly community-based organization that we had set up a relationship with at the same time that we were setting up the relationship with the employer on-site manager. So I think those personal relationship building, trust building, and taking advantage of how desperate the employers are right now is a winning combination.
And my last word is just that for anyone who's on this webinar, if you ever need some researchers or computer nerds or policy advice in your corner, don't hesitate to give us a call. We love working with folks. If you ever find yourself talking to a large employer or like state legislature especially, and want to come back to like what can they do specifically, happy to chat more about that. So thanks for including us today.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you for that offer, Erin, to our grantees on the call. So I want to thank everyone for joining the webinar today, and a special thank you to the speakers. We hope that you found this conversation useful. If you have any questions, please feel reach out to me. I will put my information in the chat, or as Erin has offered, to reach out to him. Also, you can find a copy of Upturn's report, Essential Work Analyzing and Hiring Technologies of Large Hourly Employers, on their website at upturn.org. So thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.